Thank you to the partners for this important discussion. And to all the distinguished speakers we have today. So many essential points have been addressed so far regarding this challenge. So I just would try to add something specifically concerning the EU framework. The Italian Federation for Human Rights, as maybe someone already knows, operates in Italy and worldwide for the promotion and the protection of human rights and the rule of law. While conducting monitoring and reporting of human rights violations, we come in contact with the victims of abuses from different countries. We have been following cases, for example, in Turkey, of course, Belarus, Iran, Venezuela, China, and Kazakhstan, where we are currently working to report the mass repression, political killings, and election fraud. These cases show us the wide systematic violation of human rights in the countries led by authoritarian regimes, harassment of activists, lawyers, and media workers, lack of fair trials, tortures, suppression of the right to freedom of expression, the use of the anti-terrorism measures to jail protesters, and even the use of the death penalty to intimidate civil society and to counteract public protests. These cases do not only tell us about individual stories. Behind such stories, there are grave human rights abuses committed systematically and with impunity. All these victims were often human rights defenders, political opponents, investigative journalists, lawyers, and are usually left without justice. And perpetrators of these abuses enjoy impunity in their own countries. We are talking about countries that in most cases have already been subject to traditional economic sanctions. However, the result is questionable. And the human rights defenders know that there's a great need for a more effective instrument. In this context, the Magnitsky sanctions represent a valuable tool for the protection of human rights, a tool which can avoid the impunity of individuals who are holding key roles in these regimes and are responsible for some of the most serious abuses, can also discourage the continuation of certain behavior. And in this sense, we can say they can facilitate the democratic transition. The Magnitsky legislation is, as we have said, is currently being used in several countries. However, as we know, countries implement this legislation in different ways, and its impact obviously depends on how it is designed. For example, the targeted sanctions can also play an important role in combating ground corruption, defined as crimes committed at a high level of government that distort policies or the central functioning of the state, and that can have a devastating impact on the rule of law. And this aspect should not be overlooked, as ground corruption undermines the stability of governments and countries. When responsible of corruption are internationally sanctioned and their assets frozen, their ability to move corrupt money abroad is restricted. And the same with their power to penetrate other countries' politics. However, for such law to be effective and to have a meaningful impact, it is crucial that most states and key international actors like the EU follow the model and support a proper implementation. And even though the cases of ground corruption have not been included, as we know, in the human rights sanction regime, in the European human rights sanction regime, the EU has undertaken its first step to implement such legislation. So in fact, last December, the Foreign Affairs Council adopted these EU Magnitsky-style sanctions under the name of the EU Global Human Rights Sanction Regime, which seeks to address serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. But let's see very briefly how this new regime works. It targets individuals, including state and non-state actors and entities responsible for or just involved in serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. An important point is that it can also target individuals and entities associated with the perpetrators. It covers serious human rights violations and abuses, genocide, crimes against humanity, torture, and other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of punishment, slavery, extrajudicial summary or arbitrary executions and killings, enforced disappearance of persons, arbitrary arrest or detention. And it's also covered other acts such as the trafficking in human rights, in human beings, sexual and gender-based violence, violation or abuses of freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, violations or abuses of freedom of opinion and expression, and violation of abuses of freedom of religious and or belief. So this regime has a broader mandate and only includes individual measures like travel ban and asset freeze, which only apply to the perpetrators listed. The High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and member states can put forward for proposals for listings. And it is then for the Council to decide on those listings. However, according to us, there are still serious concerns with this legislation. The first one is that these sanctions require unanimous agreement and not qualified majority. And as we know, this can often be difficult to achieve and can put obstacles in the way of its potential effectiveness. The second one is that, as already mentioned, the legislation doesn't mention corruption. And the third one is that NGOs are not allowed to point the fingers at human rights offenders. So last Wednesday, the foreign ministers of the EU agreed to impose travel bans and asset freezes on 4 individuals, those responsible for Navalny's arrest, sentencing and persecution. And this would be the first use of this new sanction regime. However, this draft list does not mention Russian oligarchs who benefit from his arrest and whose corruption has been exposed by Navalny. And the reason, according to Borrell, is the lack of evidence. So in that sense, we know that there's still a lot to do in order to have a tool that can really make a difference. But we should keep on working on the weak points on this EU new regime that obviously we are happy to have. This should be a tool which empowers individuals and civil society, as their participation is an added value in the process of uncovering human rights and in the process of collecting evidence. Also, this is a tool to be used in coordination with the other countries. Countries which use the Magnitsky Laws should act together to combat impunity. And the global and cross cooperation in the process of targeting perpetrators is crucial. That's why we also should continue to urge the member states to adopt their own legislation. So thank you.